at 18:35 hours on October 13, 1944. A Type 91 aerial torpedo struck USS Canberra on the starboard side below the armor belt. The explosion ripped a jagged hole 16 feet wide into her engineering spaces. 4,500 tons of water flooded through the breach in minutes. The afterfire room disappeared beneath the sea. Both engine rooms filled. Steam lines ruptured. Boilers went cold. 23 men died instantly, crushed by the detonation or drowned in the flooding compartments. The 13,600-ton heavy cruiser went dead in the water 90 miles from Japanese air bases on Formosa, with darkness falling and more attacks inbound. This was not the last U.S. cruiser sunk in World War II. USS Indianapolis would claim that terrible distinction 9 months later when a Japanese submarine torpedoed her after delivering atomic bomb components to Tinian. Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes. 880 men died. Canberra's fate was different. She didn't sink. She floated, powerless and vulnerable, while her crew fought to save her, and Admiral William Halsey made a decision that would transform disaster into opportunity. The crippled cruiser would become bait. The Americans would use Canberra and another damaged ship to lure the Japanese fleet into a trap. It almost worked. The story begins not with the torpedo, but with the name. USS Canberra was laid down as USS Pittsburgh on September 3, 1941 at Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. She was hull number CA-70, a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser. During construction, events in the Pacific changed her identity. On August 9, 1942, the Australian heavy cruiser HMS Canberra was sunk at the Battle of Savo Island. The engagement was a disaster for Allied forces. 4 cruisers lost, over 1,000 sailors killed. Canberra absorbed 24 shell hits and 2 torpedoes before her crew scuttled her. 84 Australian sailors died with their ship. President Franklin Roosevelt decided to honor the Australian sacrifice. On October 16, 1942, he directed that CA-70 be renamed USS Canberra. This was unprecedented. No U.S. Navy ship had ever been named for a foreign capital city. The gesture acknowledged Australia's contributions to the Pacific War and the alliance between the two nations. When Lady Alice Dixon, wife of Australia's ambassador to the United States, christened the cruiser at her launching on April 19, 1943, she named a ship that carried the memory of Australian dead into battle. USS Canberra, commissioned October 14, 1943. She measured 673 feet 5 inches overall length, beam 70 feet 10 inches, standard displacement 13,600 tons, full load displacement approximately 17,000 tons. 4 sets of General Electric geared turbines drove 4 shafts. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generated 120,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed 33 knots. Range 10,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. The main battery consisted of 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward in superfiring position, 1 aft. The Mark 15 8-inch gun fired a 335-pound armor-piercing projectile at 2,600 feet per second muzzle velocity. Maximum range 31,600 yards at 41 degrees elevation. Rate of fire 3 rounds per minute per gun sustained. The turrets were electrically trained and elevated, controlled by Mark 8 fire control computers, receiving data from Mark 34 fire control directors. Secondary armament included 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 6 twin mounts. These weapons engaged both surface and air targets. The 5-inch gun fired a 54-pound projectile at 2,600 feet per second. Maximum range 18,200 yards against surface targets. Maximum ceiling 37,200 feet against aircraft. Rate of fire 15 rounds per minute per gun. The anti-aircraft battery was completed by 48 40mm Bofors guns in quad mounts and 24 20mm Oerlikon guns in single and twin mounts. Protection included 4-inch belt armor over machinery and magazines, 2.5-inch deck armor over vital spaces, 8-inch turret faces, 6-inch barbettes, 5-inch conning tower. The Baltimore class were treaty cruisers designed within Washington naval treaty limitations, then modified after treaty restrictions lapsed. They balanced firepower, protection, and speed effectively. They were the finest heavy cruisers the United States built during World War II. Canberra departed Boston January 14, 1944. She sailed to Pearl Harbor via San Diego, arriving February 1st. She joined Task Force 58 on February 14th. For the next 8 months, she fought across the Central Pacific. Enuedoc, the Palos, Truck, Marcus Island, Wake Island, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Campaign, Peleliu. Every major operation from February through September. She bombarded shore installations. She screened carriers. She shot down Japanese aircraft. She accumulated 7 battle stars. Her crew gained experience. Her captain, Alexander R. Early, established a reputation for aggressive ship handling and accurate gunnery. By October, Task Force 38 was preparing for the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines. Pre-invasion strikes against Japanese air bases on Formosa were scheduled for October 12th through 14th. The objective was to destroy Japanese air power before it could interfere with the Leyte landings. Canberra sailed with Task Group 38.1, 3 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers including Canberra, 14 destroyers. They would provide the gun escort while carrier aircraft struck Formosa. The strikes began October 10th against Okinawa. October 11th targeted northern Luzon. October 12th, the carriers turned toward Formosa. The attacks caught Japanese forces preparing their own offensive. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down attempting to intercept the strikes. But the Japanese hit back hard. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers attacked the American task force. The gun escorts threw up curtains of anti-aircraft fire. Fighters from the carriers engaged at maximum range. The defense was effective. Most attackers were destroyed, but some got through. On October 13th at 1835 hours, 7 Yokosuka P-1 Y Ginga torpedo bombers approached Task Group 38.1 from the northwest. These were twin-engine aircraft, Allied reporting name Francis, carrying 1 800-kilogram torpedo each. Fast, maneuverable, difficult targets. The carriers were recovering aircraft from the day's strikes. The escorts were maneuvering to maintain station while providing anti-aircraft coverage. The formation was vulnerable. The attack window was brief but real. Canberra's gun crews tracked the incoming aircraft. The 5-inch mounts opened fire at maximum range. The 40mm guns joined as range decreased. Tracers filled the sky. 1 aircraft fell. Another, the remaining 5, pressed their attacks. At 1,500 yards, they released torpedoes and turned away. Most torpedoes ran wild or were evaded by maneuver. One ran true. It struck Canberra on the starboard side just aft of amidships, precisely where the armor belt thinned over the engineering spaces. The explosion was massive. The Type 91 torpedo carried a 490-pound warhead. The detonation occurred below the waterline against structural plating only 1 inch thick. The blast opened a hole 16 feet wide by 12 feet high. The afterfire room was open to the sea. Water pressure at 20 feet depth drove the ocean into the ship at thousands of gallons per second. Before damage control teams could close watertight doors and isolate the compartments, 4,500 tons of water had flooded in. The afterfire room was completely flooded. Both engine rooms, one forward and one aft of the impact point, were breached. Water rose past the deck plates, submerging the turbines, drowning the spaces. 23 men were in the flooded compartments when the torpedo hit. The explosion killed some instantly. Others were trapped when the compartments filled faster than they could escape. The hatches and watertight doors that might have saved them were open during normal steaming conditions. By the time survivors could reach the closures, water pressure made them impossible to shut. The men below drowned in darkness while their shipmates fought to save the vessel above. Commander Early assessed the damage within minutes. No propulsion, no steam, no electrical power from the main generators. Emergency diesel generators provided minimal lighting and communications. The ship was listing 5 degrees to starboard from the flooding. Counter-flooding on the port side corrected the list, but added more weight. Canberra sat lower in the water, wounded, immobile, with Japanese air bases 90 miles away and night falling. Admiral Halsey aboard USS New Jersey received the damage reports. His task force was deep in enemy-controlled waters. The Leyte landings were scheduled to begin in 1 week. His carriers had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, but more remained. Canberra could not move. The only options were to sink her and rescue the crew, or tow her to safety. Either option would require diverting significant forces from combat operations. The tactical situation was deteriorating. More air attacks were inbound. The risk was enormous. Halsey chose to tow. The heavy cruiser Wichita took Canberra under tow at approximately 1900 hours October 13th. The seamanship was remarkable. Canberra was dead in the water with no power to operate her anchor windlass or towing gear. Wichita had to maneuver alongside in darkness while under potential air attack. Pass a tow line, secure it to Canberra's structure, and begin pulling 13,000 tons of damaged ship through the water. The cruiser Boston and destroyers formed a screen. The small formation began moving east at 6 knots, away from Formosa, toward Leyte Atoll, 700 nautical miles distant. On October 14th at 06:06 hours, USS Houston, a Cleveland-class light cruiser operating with another task group, was torpedoed amidships. Her engineering spaces flooded. She lost power. The heavy cruiser Boston took Houston under tow. By midday October 14th, 2 crippled cruisers were being towed east with minimal escort. The formation was designated Crippled Division 1. The nickname was accurate. 2 ships unable to maneuver. 2 ships providing tow. A handful of destroyers. No carrier support. No battleship protection. They were limping away from Japanese-controlled waters at walking speed. This was the situation that gave Admiral Halsey an idea. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had reported the attacks and claimed massive damage to American forces. Tokyo Rose was broadcasting that the U.S. fleet had been devastated. The Japanese believed they had crippled the carrier task force. What if Halsey reinforced that belief? What if he used the crippled cruisers as bait to lure the Japanese fleet into range of his undamaged carriers? The risk to Canberra and Houston would increase. But if the trap worked, the Japanese fleet might be destroyed. The strategic gain justified the tactical gamble. Halsey ordered the formation redesignated Bait Division. Additional escorts joined. 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers. The formation slowed to 4 knots, making themselves more vulnerable, more attractive as targets. American radio operators broadcast messages in low-level codes the Japanese could break, reporting distress, requesting assistance, describing extensive damage. The messages were designed to be intercepted and decoded. They painted a picture of a fleeing, crippled formation barely afloat, easy prey for surface forces. The Japanese took the bait. Elements of the combined fleet sortied from the inland sea. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The force steamed south toward the reported position of the American cripples. For several hours, Halsey's trap seemed ready to spring. His undamaged task groups positioned themselves east of the Bait Division, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, ready to strike when the Japanese surface force came within carrier aircraft range. Then the Japanese stopped. An American airstrike against the approaching fleet caused damage and casualties. Japanese commanders reassessed. Intelligence reports were conflicting. Some sources indicated the American carrier force was more intact than initially believed. The risk of a trap seemed real. The Japanese fleet reversed course and withdrew to the inland sea. The trap failed. The surface engagement never occurred, but the Japanese air forces continued attacking. On October 16th at approximately 17:30 hours, another torpedo struck Houston in the stern above her rudder. The explosion destroyed steering control and started fires in the aircraft hangar. Houston's damage was now critical. She had taken 2 torpedo hits in 2 days. Her crew had evacuated all but 200 men to destroyers. The ship was barely afloat, but she remained under tow. The Bait Division continued east. For 14 days, the 2 cruisers were towed across open ocean. The tugs Muncie and Pawnee took over towing duties from Wichita and Boston. The specialized fleet tugs were designed for this mission. Equipped with powerful winches and heavy towing gear, they pulled the cruisers at 4 to 6 knots, maintaining course, adjusting for winds and currents, protecting their tow lines from parting under strain. The destroyers screened against submarine attack. The escorts maintained anti-aircraft vigilance. No additional attacks materialized. The Japanese had lost track of the formation or decided the targets were not worth additional resources. On October 27th, Canberra and Houston arrived at Leyte Atoll. The tow had covered approximately 700 nautical miles in 14 days at an average speed of slightly over 4 knots. Both ships remained afloat despite catastrophic damage. The salvage effort was one of the most successful of the Pacific War. Ships that should have sunk were saved. Crews that could have been lost were preserved. The cost was time and resources diverted from combat operations. The benefit was 2 cruisers that could eventually return to service. At Ulithi, USS Ajax, a repair ship, provided emergency services. Pumps removed water from flooded compartments. Welders sealed the worst breaches. Electricians restored basic power. The work was temporary, sufficient to allow the ships to be moved to better facilities. Canberra departed Ulithi November 10th under tow by Munsey, now joined by the commercial tug Watch Hill, chartered by the Warshipping Administration. The destination was Manus in the Admiralty Islands, where Advanced Base Sectional Dock 2 could accommodate the damaged cruiser. The voyage took 3 weeks. On December 1st, Canberra entered ABSD-2, the floating dry dock, designed to support forward-deployed naval forces, could lift ships up to 40,000 tons displacement. Canberra was pumped dry. The full extent of the damage became visible. The torpedo hole was 16 feet wide, extending from below the keel to above the waterline. Internal bulkheads were buckled. Deck plating was torn. The after-fire room was destroyed. Both engine rooms required complete rebuilding. Equipment throughout the stern section was corroded from saltwater immersion. On December 1st, a volunteer salvage party entered fire rooms 3 and 4. They found the bodies of 13 men who had been killed by the explosion or trapped when the compartments flooded. The remains were recovered and buried with military honors. 10 men remained missing, presumably washed out through the torpedo hole or trapped in spaces that could not be accessed. Their bodies were never recovered. Temporary repairs at Manus took until February 16, 1945. Steel plates welded over the torpedo damage made the hull watertight. 1 boiler and 2 turbines were restored to operation. Canberra could steam under her own power at reduced speed. She departed Manus for Boston Navy Yard on February 16th, transited via Pearl Harbor and the Panama Canal, arrived Boston March 1st. Permanent repairs required 8 months. New boilers, new turbines, new electrical systems, reconstructed compartments, upgraded anti-aircraft weapons. The ship was essentially rebuilt from the waterline up in the damaged sections. Canberra was ready for service October 17, 1945. The war had ended 6 weeks earlier. She sailed to the Pacific coast, joined the reserve fleet, and was decommissioned March 7, 1947 at Bremerton, Washington. Her wartime service was over. 7 battle stars, 8 months of combat operations, 1 torpedo hit that should have sunk her. She survived because her crew fought to save her and because Admiral Halsey decided she was worth the risk of towing. The post-war story adds context. In January 1952, Canberra was redesignated CAG-2 and towed to Camden, New Jersey for conversion to a guided missile cruiser. The work took 4 years. The aft 8-inch turret was removed. 2 Terrier surface-to-air missile launchers were installed. Advanced radars and fire control systems were added. She recommissioned June 15, 1956 as the 2nd guided missile cruiser in the U.S. Navy, following her sister Boston. As CAG-2, Canberra served through the Cold War. She carried President Eisenhower to Bermuda in March 1957 for a conference with the British Prime Minister. She participated in the International Naval Review in June 1957. She hosted the ceremony selecting the unknown soldiers of World War II and Korea in May 1958. She completed an 8-month around-the-world cruise in 1960, visiting 26 ports, operating with both 6th and 7th Fleets. She participated in the Cuban Missile Crisis naval blockade in October 1962. From 1965 through 1969, Canberra deployed to Vietnam 5 times. Her 8-inch guns, retained during the conversion, provided naval gunfire support for ground forces. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, she fired 35,000 rounds in 31 days, supporting troops at Hue. On May 1, 1968, she was redesignated CA-70, reverting to heavy cruiser classification after her Terrier missiles became obsolescent. She retained the missile launchers, but her 8-inch guns were considered her primary armament. Canberra was decommissioned February 2, 1970, stricken from the Naval Vessel Register July 31, 1978, sold for scrap July 15, 1980. She was broken up at National Metal and Steel in Terminal Island, California. 1 propeller was preserved and displayed at the Los Angeles Maritime Museum. The ship's bell was retained in storage and eventually presented to Australian Prime Minister John Howard by President George W. Bush. returning to Australia 64 years after the ship that bore her name was lost. The historical significance of USS Canberra extends beyond her combat record. She represented the alliance between the United States and Australia, named for a foreign capital to honor Allied sacrifice. She demonstrated that heavily damaged ships could be saved through aggressive salvage operations and crew determination. She proved that guided missile conversions could extend the service life of World War II-era cruisers into the missile age. And she fought in 3 different conflicts across 27 years. Adapting to changing warfare requirements from gun actions in 1944 to missile defense in 1962 to shore bombardment in 1968. But the defining moment was October 13, 1944. The torpedo that should have sunk her, the crew that fought to save her, the admiral who decided to tow her rather than scuttle her. The 2-week voyage at 4 knots across 700 miles of ocean while under potential attack. The transformation from crippled to bait to survivor. That sequence of events created a story worth preserving. The technical aspects merit examination. The type. 91 torpedo was designed specifically for aircraft delivery. Weight, 730 kilograms, including warhead. Length, 5.4 meters. Diameter, 450 millimeters. The warhead contained 205 kilograms of Type 97 explosive, approximately 490 pounds. The weapon was stabilized in flight by a parachute that deployed after release and detached before water entry. Depth setting was typically 3 to 4 meters to strike below armor belts. Speed approximately 40 knots. Range approximately 2,000 meters from release point. The Yokosuka P-1 Waiginga aircraft that delivered the torpedo was a land-based twin-engine attack bomber. Crew 3. Maximum speed, 547 kilometers per hour. Range 5,470 kilometers. Armament 1 760mm torpedo or 800 kilograms of bombs plus 120mm cannon and 1 13mm machine gun for defense. The aircraft was introduced in 1944 as a replacement for the Mitsubishi G4M Betty. Allied intelligence designated it Francis. Approximately 1,100 were built. The type was effective against shipping, but vulnerable to fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The damage to Canberra was severe but not immediately fatal. The torpedo struck below the armor belt where plating was 1 inch thick. The armor belt itself was 4 inches thick, extending from the waterline to the main deck over machinery and magazines. The torpedo struck below this protection, exploiting the weakness that all treaty cruisers shared. Heavy armor on vertical surfaces, minimal armor on horizontal surfaces and below the waterline. The design reflected treaty limitations and doctrinal assumptions about engagement ranges and attack angles. The flooding was rapid but not instantaneous. 4,500 tons entered the ship over approximately 10 minutes. This represented roughly 1/3 of the ship's standard displacement being added as water weight. The ship settled deeper, listing initially until counterflooding corrected the angle. The weight reduced freeboard, bringing the main deck closer to the waterline, increasing vulnerability to flooding from additional damage. But the ship remained buoyant because enough watertight compartments remained intact. The subdivision design, though compromised by the explosion, was sufficient to prevent capsizing or sinking. The towing operation required specialized knowledge. A dead ship under tow creates enormous stress on the tow line. The weight pulls continuously. Wave action adds dynamic loading. The tow line must be strong enough to handle maximum loads but flexible enough to absorb shock. The connection points on both ships must be reinforced to prevent structural failure. The towing speed must be slow enough to avoid parting the line, but fast enough to make progress toward safety. Wichita initially provided tow using her anchor chain shackled to Canberra's anchor chain. This was emergency procedure using equipment available immediately. The chain was strong but inflexible, as the formation gained distance from immediate threat. The fleet tugs took over using proper towing gear, heavy braided steel cable, multi-part bridles distributing load across multiple attachment points, shock absorbers to dampen dynamic loads. The professional tugboat crews had trained for this mission. Their expertise made the difference between success and losing the ship. The bait division concept reflected Halsey's aggressive mindset. He had commanded carrier task forces throughout the Pacific campaign. He understood risk. He accepted casualties when tactical gains justified them. Using crippled ships as bait to lure enemy forces into a trap was consistent with his operational style. The concept worked in principle. The Japanese sortied, but coordination between the sortie and American positioning was imperfect. The timing was wrong. The Japanese withdrew before the trap closed. The bait division survived, but the intended result, destruction of Japanese surface forces, was not achieved. The psychological impact on Canberra's crew was significant. They had fought their ship across the Pacific for 8 months. They had developed confidence in their vessel and their capabilities. The torpedo hit shattered that confidence instantly. Within seconds, 23 shipmates were dead. The ship was powerless. They were under tow, dependent on other vessels, unable to fight, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to attack. For 2 weeks, they lived with that vulnerability. Some crew members were evacuated to destroyers, reducing the number of men exposed to risk. Those who remained worked damage control, manned the guns, waited. The uncertainty was corrosive. They didn't know if additional attacks would come. They didn't know if the tow would hold. They didn't know if they would reach safety. When Canberra finally entered Leyte, the relief was overwhelming. They had survived. The ship was afloat. The tow had worked, but the ship was finished as a combat unit for the duration. The crew was split up. Some transferred to other ships. Some returned to the United States. Some remained with Canberra through repairs. The community that had formed over 8 months of combat operations was disbanded. This was standard practice, but emotionally difficult for men who had depended on each other through combat and crisis. The repair period allowed reflection. Why had they been hit? What could have been done differently? The answers were unsatisfying. The attack was well executed. The torpedo release was at optimal range. The speed and angle of approach minimized defensive fire opportunities. The hit location was precisely where the ship was most vulnerable. It was professional work by the Japanese aircrew. The American defense had shot down 2 of 7 attackers, a 71% success rate by defensive standards, but the one that got through had delivered a nearly fatal blow. The counterfactual question persists. What if Canberra had sunk? What if the towing operation had failed? What if Japanese surface forces had found the bait division and engaged? The answers remain unknowable, but the questions illuminate the nature of combat operations where small differences in execution, timing, or luck determine outcomes. Canberra survived because multiple factors aligned. Competent damage control, effective towing, absent follow-up attacks, favorable weather. Any one factor failing differently could have produced sinking rather than survival. The legacy is institutional as well as individual. The U.S. Navy learned lessons from the Canberra experience. Damage control procedures were refined. Towing equipment was improved. Salvage doctrine was updated. Forward deployed repair facilities like ABSD-2 proved their value. The ability to repair ships near the combat zone rather than sending them back to the United States shortened the time ships were unavailable for operations. This was critical in the Pacific, where distances were enormous and transit times measured in weeks. The name Canberra carried forward. After CA-70 was scrapped, the name was assigned to a new littoral combat ship, USS Canberra, LCS-30, commissioned July 22, 2023. This was only the second time a U.S. Navy ship had been named for a foreign capital, both times honoring Australia. The continuity of the name preserves the memory of the alliance and the sacrifice that the name commemorates. For the crew who served aboard CA-70, the ship was more than steel and machinery. She was home, workplace, community, the place where they became adults, where they faced danger, where they lost friends. The torpedo hit on October 13th. 1944 was the defining moment of their service. Some were in the flooded compartments and died. Some fought to save the ship and succeeded. Some were evacuated and watched from destroyers as their ship was towed to safety. All carried the memory forward through decades. The knowledge that they had been tested and had responded, that their ship had been hit and had survived. That is the story of USS Canberra CA-70, not the last cruiser lost in the war. That was Indianapolis. Not the most decorated cruiser. That distinction belongs to others. But a ship that represented an alliance, that survived when she might have sunk, that was towed 700 miles at 4 knots while serving as bait for a trap that almost worked. And that served for 27 years across 3 conflicts before being broken up for scrap in 1980. A ship named for a foreign city to honor Allied dead. A ship hit by a torpedo that killed 23 and crippled her, but didn't sink her. A ship that became bait and survived. That is enough of a story. That is worth remembering.